Comrades, you're listening to The Party Line, a podcast from The Ditch, news and comment from Ireland on theditch.com. I'm Harry Browne.
And I'm Niamh Keady-Tabbal, and you can follow The Party Line, spread The Party Line, and get on The Ditch's WhatsApp feed at ontheditch.com.
We're joined in studio by Paulie Doyle from The Ditch. How are you, Paulie?
Hi, Paulie.
How are we doing?
See you.
And we're also delighted to be joined by Niamh Keady-Tabbal. Niamh is a postdoctoral researcher in law at Maynooth University. Her PhD work, which she did in Galway, focused on EU border and migration policy and how it erodes the right to seek asylum. She's now part of a project based in Maynooth that focuses on the Irish border throughout history and looking in specifically at the effects of the border on migration in Ireland today. So thanks a million for coming in, Niamh.
Thank you.
Welcome,
Thanks
Niamh.
for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. We'll have a lot to talk about with you today. But first, as always, we'll have a word from our sponsors at The Ditch on theditch.com. Paulie, what's in The Ditch at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, we've done another story about the media regulator,
Right.
Commission Amman. While back, we did some coverage about its relationship to the media minister, Patrick O'Donovan, and a call that he made trying to launch an investigation into coverage of the fuel protests that he didn't like. This time around, we're looking at a report that it published recently, looking at ownership of media and looking at kind of media plurality in the country. And there was a very, very interesting part submitted actually by T.G. Cahir.
Okay, so this is a submission to Commission Amman.
One of the stakeholders they engaged with
Right.
preparing this report. And they said that...
They being T.G. Cahir.
Yes.
Yeah.
They said that, the NUACT is provided by RTE. And they said that, Ireland may be violating the European Media Freedom Act, which entitles people to a plurality of independent media. And two, that RTE is operating in this regard as a monopoly.
So an attack on RT as a monopoly, but not coming from the kind of the commercial sector, which we talked about in a recent episode with Betty Purcell, the kind of hostility that you sometimes get from commercial media towards RT, but actually coming from T.G. Cahir on the basis partly of its kind of constrained relationship with RT.
They warned, RT had been, the state has been warned about this before, and it was in August of 2025, and they've still done nothing about this issue. And it speaks to how little they care about media independence, about freedom of media, and about actually having a functioning media, which we're perpetually told is essential for this precious democracy of ours.
So the issue in particular that T.G. Cahir raised is in relation to NUACT. So
NUACT,
can you break that down for us a little bit?
So the NUACT service is provided by RTE.
So T.G. Cahir's...
So it's not they don't have editorial independence for this news service that they offer.
So T.G. Cahir goes out on T.G. Cahir, but it's provided by RTE.
Yeah, exactly, which is problematic for them, and it's also problematic when it comes to EU law, because it means that RTE has an effective, according to them, monopoly on this service. So they've also said, by the way, that they had very limited funds and couldn't commission more than 10 hours of investigative reporting. So, I mean, it seems like a cut and dry issue of maybe we should just give them the resources that they actually need and let them get on with it.
Because we were only discussing recently that T.G. Cahir's programming, its documentaries, etc., are very, very good.
Yeah.
They're outstanding.
Yeah. But they're not.
Which might be why they don't get as much funding as perhaps one might expect.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, no, we had spoken about, it was when there was the report card from the Independent, I think, on how RTE is doing. And they completely ignored that there is any dimension of Irish language broadcasting at all inside RTE, completely ignored T.G. Cahir and
of course T.G. Cahir should be outside RTE, and that is possibly part of the sort of confusion about this. T.G. Cahir is not a branch of RTE as such.
No.
Yeah.
No, so, I mean, it should be independent. It should be, and we're doing a disservice to the public by not giving them the resources that they need. And it's so straightforward. Why hasn't this been done? So what T.G. Cahir gets instead is sort of crumbs from the RTE table is the suggestion here. And T.G. Cahir wants to see that change. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Paulie, thank you for that. That's really, really, really interesting. And as always, we go on after we've discussed what's in the ditch this week. We talk about a piece of non-ditch media, the NDM. Usually we do so somewhat critically, but we actually wanted with Niamh here to talk about some of the coverage of Ceuta that has been in the media, and some of it not so bad. Like this piece that we saw in The Guardian over the weekend that talks about the what was going on at the border crossing. It's a piece with a double byline from that enclave in North Africa from Okba Mohammed and Javier Jennings Mozo in Ceuta. Niamh has been guiding us on how to pronounce the name of that location. And this was a really interesting piece, I thought, because it was real kind of on-the-ground reportage talking to migrants themselves about both their experience of the crossing, their experience of what brought them to that place, and also what had happened since. What did you make of this piece, Niamh?
I thought compared to a lot of the other coverage I was seeing that it was more humanizing, and you could hear from the perspective of the person that found himself in this situation. And like compared to a lot of the coverage which was about, an invasion, a crisis, or on the other hand, like people being portrayed as like pawns that have been completely manipulated, I think like it kind of gets a little bit more at the kind of nuance.
Right, so they're neither pawns nor are they invaders in this piece. They're human beings, which is a breakthrough in its own right. And it's also, it's a way, if you like, beneath and beyond the kind of the state politics that's been dominated so much of the discussion about Spain's policy and other countries critical of Spain's policy. So it opens. 4 days ago, Youssef El Abba saw an opportunity to reclaim the life he had lost 7 years earlier. So we're immediately with a person who previously had been in Spain and worked in Spain and had a life in Spain and had to leave. News was circulating that about 400 people had swum from Morocco to the neighboring Spanish enclave of Ceuta on the North African coast, approximately 12 miles across the Strait of Gibraltar from Spain. Here was a chance for the 44-year-old Moroccan father of four, and again, we kind of humanize him, his family relationships, etc., to return to Spain, from which he'd been deported when his residency expired after the loss of his job in Bilbao in 2019. And then the story of how it was, the social media posts he saw, the modes of transport he used, and then, of course, crucially, the role of the Moroccan police in what occurred in those few days last week. So was there anything new that we learned here, do you think, Niamh, about how from the experience, and he's not the only person, of course, quoted in the piece, but it's kind of the Moroccan police were shouting at us, go, 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 run into Spain, he said.
I think it shows, like, in this case, like, the fact that the Moroccan authorities have the capacity to, loosen or tighten the border controls. Like, that's obviously very important when it comes to this specific incident, but a lot of the coverage that we've been seeing kind of distorts the broader reality, which is one where, like, EU migration policy is really centred around externalization, so outsourcing the border controls to countries like Morocco, which then in turn gives states like Morocco the capacity to instrumentalize, as the EU governments like to term it, when it suits them. But really what's more important is actually the fact that there are so many people who are in places like Morocco and other countries that get called transit countries, who are waiting to either return to lives that they had established or to try and build a life in safety, to flee for their lives, and the only reason they can't is because of the very militarized EU border regimes and racist border regimes that, prevent certain people from entering the EU based on their nationality, but really in reality the colour of their skin and the amount of money that they have.
Yeah, so the Moroccan government and the Moroccan police didn't conjure tens of thousands of people out of thin air.
Yeah, this is kind of the backlash to these externalization policies. It's like the EU already is treating them as pawns, and then sometimes it gets turned the other direction.
Yeah.
Right, so
maybe it's because I remember kind of seeing this unfolding first with a video that I saw on Twitter. So maybe it's just useful to talk through what actually happened, because there were videos being circulated on Twitter of lots of people coming across the sea swimming and getting around the border as it juts out into the water. And I was following it then. Once I saw it on Twitter, then I started following it on Spanish media, so on RTV. And the headline throughout, they have a screen with a title running at the bottom, and it was, migration crisis. And so you're immediately and instantly being told there's a crisis. And at that point, they were reporting that I think it was a couple of hundred, and then the numbers went up to a couple of thousand. And I think by Thursday evening was it 4,000 people had managed to make it across swimming from Morocco into the Spanish enclave of Ceuta. And they were calling it, a migration crisis, and what are we going to do with these 4,000 people? And then at that point, the question, the Spanish PP and the Vox party, so, far right parties, were calling on Pedro Sanchez to send in the army, which he said by Thursday evening he was going to do. So obviously, there was huge concern. If he sends in the army, what are they being sent in to do? What is their mandate? At the same time, people are continuing to stream over the border. Nobody quite understands, because I think it's important to point out as well that there's people constantly trying to get from from Morocco into Ceuta or into Melilla. Or there's constantly
the other Spanish enclave.
So there's two Spanish enclaves on the North African coast, Ceuta and Melilla. They're tiny cities. And also just the kind of the narrative that then came about as these people are swimming across, is that this is an unprotected border. It needs to be further militarised. And you cannot imagine a more militarised border than Ceuta and Melilla. I was in Melilla in 2023, and it is, it is a massive fenced area. Then you have concertina wire, you have militarised police, you have the army on both sides, on the Moroccan side and on the Spanish side. Then you have motion sensors, you have, drones, you have cameras. This is kind of the pilot project of what you want a militarised border to look like is Ceuta and Melilla. And kind of from there, that was the example that was then to be transferred to other places. And so you've all these people swimming across, and maybe it's interesting also for Niamh's research, they immediately start to blame a Supreme Court ruling, a Spanish Supreme Court ruling, which I haven't read the entire ruling, but a few weeks ago, the Spanish Supreme Court ruled that what they call devoluciones en caliente, which is, they say it's hot returns. That's how they translate pushbacks. That pushbacks at sea, so in alta mar, at sea, are not allowed.
Right.
And that goes to the research that you were doing as well in Greece, that pushbacks at sea are not allowed. And so it was immediately the kind of the European Union political take from different European member states was that Spain had a weak legal system. And thank God that we have this EU pact on asylum and migration that will now pick up pace where Spain's legal system is weak, and we can actually return these people. And, you had statements coming from European commissioners that thank God we have this, deportation hubs.
The crisis and force majeure regulations, all of these are kind of exceptional.
And that we can now use this so-called crisis in Ceuta to actually then expel or deport all of these people. This shows exactly why we need the EU legislation, because the Spanish legislation is weak,
right.
And we can rely on that to actually send people back or anywhere else that's not the European Union, basically.
And it's almost kind of an experimental border regime out there, of course, as well, because although these are fully Spanish territory, it is also more or less impossible for people who are not EU citizens to travel from those places to mainland Spain. Like that even if you were to swim in and find yourself there, you're stuck there.
Yeah, exactly.
As well.
You can, to get from there onwards to mainland Spain, you would be travelling by water, either on some sort of a raft or trying to get on board one of the ships that are leaving. And again, there was this thing that one of the political responses was Italy saying we're going to suspend our Schengen border agreement with Spain so that any ships coming from Spain or flights coming from Spain will not be going through Schengen as usual, but will be subject to additional border checks. So Italy doing that, then France saying that they were going to strengthen their border control between Spain and France, Finland.
Yeah.
It's completely performative.
Finland,
context.
the Danes also. So you had all of these European Union countries falling into line saying we're going to suspend the Schengen Agreement in respect of the Spanish participation in it, so that if anyone comes from Spain, they will be, any flights from Spain
There'll be additional checks.
Yeah, without, and you're just wondering, have any of these people seen the map? Do they know where Ceuta actually is?
Yes, yeah.
Like
they're not coming from Spain.
What are
Yes,
they? This is like Friday, mid-morning Friday. The Finns are saying we're going to now suspend. I mean, you've just swam across from Morocco to Ceuta, and you're not going to make it to Helsinki by that evening.
Yeah, you're not jumping on a direct raft to Helsinki. Yeah, can I just? I want to kind of go a little bit deeper on Spain here, because to some extent that the argument that you've kind of developed here, in which these countries are criticizing the weak Spanish regime, too sympathetic, in other words. But in point of fact, of course, the Spanish regime, for one, has sort of characterized this as an invasion, has pointed the finger at so-called human trafficking mafias as being responsible for all this. So it's not as though Spain is some kind of highly sympathetic open door policy in relation to this migration. I want to ask you about that, Niamh, and also in particular about this idea of the human trafficking mafia as the kind of the villain that lurks in the background of these kind of phenomena.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back a little bit about the point about the ruling about, and how that was used to portray Spain as maybe a weak link. Like, that ruling is already setting a standard that's much lower than the prohibition that already exists in international law, as flawed as it is. Be specific about that for us, because it's about the right to seek asylum, isn't it? Yeah, the right to seek asylum, but also I guess the right to not be pushed back. States are not. And I say this like with all the criticism of the international legal framework, but even in terms of the protections that exist there, states are not allowed to just push people back. Even if somebody crosses a border without a visa, without the right paperwork, they have the right to apply for asylum and go through a process, even if they're not applying for asylum, still for there to be an individualized kind of assessment, an individual procedure before they're returned. So the kinds of mass expulsions or collective expulsions that Spain has really spearheaded are not lawful.
And the Spanish Supreme Court has said that, but not in
full. Only in relation to people crossing by sea. They're still accepting and normalizing pushbacks from the land borders.
As you say, in violation of international law.
Yes.
Yeah. So Spain is hardly the hero.
No, and the kind of what we've seen across Europe, across the EU, has been like states trying to normalize pushbacks, but like also using the law to do so. And one way that they've done that is by taking the example from Spain, where in a very famous case from 2020, like the European Court of Human Rights basically accepted the Spanish government's position and said that when people are crossing into these territories of Ceuta and Melilla, and crossing the border, that was framed as kind of culpable conduct. They're blaming migrants then for whatever violations they later face. So,
right.
Basically, if you cross the border without permission and then the state violates your rights, it's your fault.
Yeah, because you did that wrong thing to start with. Yeah. And what about this kind of deployment of mafia as the kind of the lurking problem?
That's kind of the classic tactic that we see all over the EU. It kind of makes it seem like there aren't people who have legitimate reasons to want to cross these borders and move, and it's just that they're victims of smuggling networks. And then you also see then the EU and EU member states talking about we need to secure the borders, militarize the borders in order to crack down on smuggling and also save lives. So they present themselves as kind of the benevolent actors then, so deploying Frontex and really militarizing the sea borders is framed as being about cracking down on smugglers who, of course, there's issues of exploitation of people, but really why do we have that? The reason we have that is because people can't cross borders safely and they don't have the right to move freely.
Maybe just on Ceuta as well. Like by Friday morning, the media was reporting that and reporting on figures that they had gotten from the Spanish Ministry of the Interior and from the Ceuta local government. They were reporting it was at one point early morning it was 30,000, then it went up to 40,000, then it was 50,000. And it was it was a really tense few hours because it was like, okay, Spain have said they're deploying the military. You know, there's images now circulating where the military is on the streets. The National Guard is on, or the Civil Guard, the Guardia Civil is on the streets. There's 50,000 people who are on, you know, the whole world is watching basically. You know, it was a really tense few hours. It was like, what are they going to do? Are they going to militarily forcefully expel these people back to Morocco? You know, anything could have happened in those few hours. And I suppose a lot of us who followed border questions for years, like I was thinking of Melilla, like there was a massacre in Melilla, which is the other enclave in 2022. And there were 23 people killed that we know of, and there were 80 I think it was 84, but it possibly was higher, people who were disappeared. Their whereabouts was never established. And they were mostly Sudanese. They were attempting to get from the Moroccan side to the Spanish side at a border crossing called El Barrio Chino. And they were in this, what the Spanish, again going to the Spanish law, they're not angels. Like they created this kind of grey zone that exists between where the line for Morocco finishes and the line for Spain starts. And you can very clearly see that the gates are open in this Melilla massacre. And the Spanish and the Moroccan forces carry out a joint operation that leads to 23 people being killed and at least 84 people being disappeared. And the people who died, you can watch the videos. It's the most horrific. It's like a slaughterhouse. You have piles, dozens of bodies, mostly Sudanese people, piled up in the midday sun, screaming for water, and the life is drained out of them. All of that video footage exists. That happened under the same Minister for the Interior. That's why I was checking his name earlier, Marlaska. So these people are not. You know, the Spanish government is now being held up as kind of, you know, they're the weakest link. You know, that Melilla massacre is just one more incident. Before that, again, there had been incidents earlier on, again, in Tarrajal. There's constantly incidents happening in relation to the Canary Islands. I think these stories rarely make news headlines in Ireland. Very few people even know of the Melilla massacre, that it even happened. And it's one of the worst atrocities to happen on a European Union border in the EU's history. But it's not just Spain. And maybe you can talk a little bit about Greece, because that's more the region that you've kind of focused on, the Greek border. Yeah. It's the whole EU deadly border regime that is based on the premise is that people will die, and that is completely fine.
And of course, that is a direct massacre, but people die in their thousands trying to make the crossing, and you know that is widely ignored as well. You know that it is literally a deadly border regime.
Yeah. Or in the deserts, you know, coming up through the Sahara Desert, there's people who are again, because the EU is externalizing border control to Mali, to Niger. Now they've shifted tack because of the changes of government in those countries. But they've been imposing a border regime across the whole of Africa. Senegal, Spain has had agreements with Senegal since the early 2000s to stop boats leaving Senegal and making their way to the Canaries, for example. So this kind of idea that the European Union is open borders, it kind of parallel to them signing into being the Schengen Agreement and opening up internal borders, they started to build up Fortress Europe externally.
I'm sure we're going to have listeners and viewers who are going to say, but something happened here. And something specific and something unusual happened here. First of all, we know directly that from direct witness evidence that the Moroccan police were saying "go, go, go," specifically to Moroccans. It seems like more than to other Africans. But there's been other kinds of speculation about Israel's potential involvement, for example, in this. Do we have any reason? I'm inviting you to speculate, but I'm inviting speculation from two Niamhs here who I know are expert in this area. Do you think there's any reason to think of this event in a larger geopolitical context?
I mean, I suppose on Friday morning, I was watching a discussion on Spanish media that was kind of drawing a parallel between a similar situation that occurred in Ceuta in 2021, involving I think it was 10,000 people who had come over from Morocco, and they had put it down to the fact that Spain had offered a Polisario leader medical care in Spain during the COVID.
Explain who Polisario is.
So the Polisario being the Western Saharan leadership, so for the Sahrawi people, that somebody from the Polisario had been offered medical care in Spain, and obviously
Morocco revenge against Spain for this act of mercy to a rebel, in effect, from the point of view of the Moroccan authorities.
Yeah, and so the speculation then on the Spanish media was, Pedro Sanchez visited Algeria last week, and now Morocco are taking revenge on Spain for having visited Algeria. And they're doing that by creating this so-called migration crisis. That was one kind of line of speculation. Sure. Then there was all sorts of mad stuff about Israel, about Morocco, because it was the Throne Day, the National Day of Morocco, that they had chosen this day in particular. Speculation about the US, about Israel. I don't know enough I would prefer not to speculate. Sure. And look at exactly what we saw happen. And I suppose because the area that we've looked at for years has been the EU stuff. So I kind of instantly started to follow what was happening in Europe, because European leaders, and that's exactly what we've seen, they will use this to further intensify what is already a deadly borders regime, and, roll out horrific, racist, really, really, really racist commentary. Like, you could already see videos of mobs that were forming. Like, there were calls to deploy real patriots was the language being used. The Spanish people would actually make their way to Ceuta and specifically target anyone that was not white. And I don't know what they were planning on doing, like vigilante mob style, we'll defend Ceuta if the Spanish government won't, kind of thing.
So that is covered in this piece that we were talking about from The Guardian, that local people have said that basically they don't want these right-wing elements coming in to defend Europe in Ceuta, that locals, in fact, are trying to help the migrants, offering to make phone calls, bringing sandwiches and bottles of water. And a local person was quoted as saying that these kind of right-wing politicians and neo-Nazis are trying to exploit our feelings to claim the credit and say they defended Ceuta, says a local woman called Malika. We don't want them here. If they want to defend something, go somewhere else.
Just in relation to Israel, there was a tweet that I think it's the Israeli representative to the UN in New York, Danny Danon. He had put out a tweet which was then quote tweeted by a Spanish minister whose name escapes me, Oscar, I can't remember his surname, and he was kind of saying, okay, now it's starting to make sense. And people took from the Spanish minister's tweet, now it's starting to make sense was, okay, none of this kind of made sense beforehand.
Now we know that Israel has a line on this.
Now we know. So kind of flowing from those tweets, then the speculation started, Israel is somehow involved in this.
Even though we've seen this before, like you already laid out how it's happened before at this particular border zone, but we've also seen it with Belarus and Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, but also the context that I've been working on, which is Turkey and Greece, and how, Turkey stopped preventing people from leaving its borders in 2020, which is a similar kind of
happens
situation.
again and again.
It happens again and again, yeah.
And partly it happens just as, a buildup of pressure almost.
A buildup of pressure, and then the fact that the EU essentially pays other countries to keep people outside of the EU.
As you say, externalizing the border regime outside the EU.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like if Morocco doesn't play ball and decides to allow all of these people through that's kind of and it's the same with Turkey when Turkey cut off the 2015 agreement and then it stopped it.
Yeah.
And it's those.
So Turkey, Morocco can sort of demand a price then for kind of restoring their own roles as external border guards for the EU.
Yeah, and I suppose the question then is kind of, well, why do we have this system in place to begin with? Why do we have the Moroccan authorities or the Turkish or the Senegalese or, kind of, we need to look much more in depth at the policy, but instead of actually looking at the policies that drive this, the response will, because there's a meeting going on right now, chaired by Ireland as the European presidency holder, to look at how the EU will respond to this. And we can be absolutely sure that the response will be more militarisation of borders, probably higher fences, more concertina wire, more motion sensors, more heart detectors.
And pushing the borders of the EU deeper and deeper into
outside
Africa. Yeah.
Rather than looking at that as the root cause to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have anything to add to that, Niamh, in terms of that, the way that externalizing works and how it surrounds Europe in effect? It's not just a question of enclaves on the North African coast.
And maybe the drift. You had said
I can bring it to that.
Bring it a little bit.
Do, please, yeah.
Yeah, well, just like I said, we've seen this happen before. So not only with the Spain, Morocco, but we've also seen it with Turkey and Greece. So like you mentioned, there's an agreement from 2016, which is the EU-Turkey statement, which is basically EU states paying Turkey to stop people from crossing the Aegean and Turkish borders into Greece. So that's been the status quo. But then in 2020, the Turkish government decided temporarily that they would kind of de facto suspend the agreement. So they would no longer keep people in Turkey and they would let people, and when I say people, I'm talking about, migrants, that includes asylum seekers and refugees, that they would let them cross into Greece. And this created a huge kind of spectacle, what was called a border crisis. Greek border guards killed people. They've been pushing people back from their borders without due process for decades, but in this instance they really ramped it up and it really became much more visible. And there was reported deaths and a lot of brutality, and that's the context in which Ursula von der Leyen came to Greece and thanked Greece for being Europe's shield. And this really gave a green light also to Greece to increase its pushbacks. But when I say pushbacks, I'm talking about illegal deportations, any kind of deportations that happen outside of a procedure. So just they could be abducting people at the border and sending them across the river, or at sea it can involve the Greek Coast Guard as well as the EU Border and Coast Guard Agency Frontex intercepting boats, so stopping boats at sea and pushing them back. But in 2020, the Greek authorities put in place a new kind of policy to push people back from their borders. And they started using life rafts, life-saving equipment to push people back. So they would stop people at sea very dangerously, take them on board their Coast Guard ships, and then put them in these rafts and just abandon them to drift. So they've been called driftbacks. But they also extended this to the islands. So when asylum seekers would reach Greek islands, and to seek asylum, go through the procedures, the authorities abduct them routinely and take them back out to sea and put them on these rescue rafts and leave them out to drift. And it involves all kinds of, incognito detention, and people's phones are systematically confiscated. That's kind of one of the really important things, because it means that even though this is happening in broad daylight, there is a real lack of evidence that asylum seekers can offer up to show exactly what's happened in these cases, because their phones are just stolen. And the evidence is often deleted as a result.
These kind of regimes presumably are widely known by the people who are trying to make these crossings. And presumably they are meant to be widely known by the people.
Yeah, it's meant to be a deterrent, you know.
How's that going?
Well, people keep trying to cross, and they keep getting pushed back, but people often, I've documented dozens and dozens of these cases, and the people that I've spoken to, maybe I made contact with them initially when they were pushed back in this really brutal way, but then eventually years later, they finally make it. So people keep trying because there's a reason why they're going to these lengths to cross the borders. There's a reason why they're willing to risk their lives.
Do you want to summarize that reason?
The reason, I mean, people are fleeing places where there's either genocide or war or absolute destitution or repression. They're often transiting through Turkey, which is a country where they don't have any access to protection or assistance. So people often say, oh, Turkey, because the EU designated Turkey as a safe country. That's kind of the basis of these externalization agreements. You say Turkey is safe, you have to be there, and therefore we're not going to give you refugee status in the EU. But there isn't access to refugee protection, really, for most people in Turkey. And people face all kinds of violations of their rights there. So, and they might also be trying to reach their family members. There's one, if I can give an example of a specific case, of a Palestinian law student from Gaza who was trying to get to the island of Samos in 2020 to get reunited with his wife, who was in the Netherlands. And he was intercepted by the Greek authorities, and potentially also in a case that implicated Frontex, the EU Coast Guard agency. And he and others were put onto these life rafts and just left to drift. So they're just spinning for hours until you eventually, hopefully, get picked up by the Turkish Coast Guard. But then you're brought back to probably detention, destitution. And in this particular case, this man eventually made it to the Netherlands, but years and years later.
It was intriguing when Niamh was introducing you to hear that you're doing work now on Ireland. We don't think of the Irish border as a site of the kind of things that you've been talking about.
Yeah.
Here. But what is it that's happening on the Irish border that is relevant to this larger picture?
Yeah, it's really interesting because for me, my work is about the different harms that come from the enforcement of borders. And normally, there's a lot of research and a lot of activists and different work that focuses on places like Greece and Spain and Italy, but Ireland is often missing from that, and that's, partially because there's been, lower numbers of people coming to Ireland, but also because the border on the island of Ireland is, invisible mostly and free of physical border infrastructure. We don't have the kinds of walls or checkpoints anymore, but at the same time there's a situation where we have the Common Travel Area, which allows Irish and British citizens to move, freely between the whole island of Ireland and Britain and beyond. But even on the island of Ireland, that's just for Irish and British citizens.
Exactly,
so if you're an immigrant, any kind of category of immigrant, you can't just freely cross from, the north to the south.
Or vice versa. Yeah.
And that creates a situation which different organisations have called a hard border for some. And it's most acutely felt by people like asylum seekers who have precarious, not permanent migration status and live in places near the border. Because there's so many parts of Ireland where people live really cross-border lives. But, so you might just live in the south and then go to the supermarket in the north. But if you're an asylum seeker, you're technically not allowed to cross the border, even though there's no kind of visible markings, besides the fact that everyone always says that the road signs change and the phone signal changes.
Currency changes if you're in one of the shops.
Yes. Too, but just in terms of how it looks, you might not even know that you've crossed, but technically your asylum case could be closed just by crossing.
Maybe just as an example, I was recently visiting a friend in Monaghan, and to get there I went through part of South Armagh, and I drove into a filling station, and I drove in while I was still in the 26th county Free State Republic or whatever, and on the coming out of the filling station, the road was different. Literally, it splits in the middle of the filling station. It's literally, quite literally, because I was like, this couldn't possibly be in the middle of the borderline.
Yeah.
And I looked it up on Google Maps after, and quite literally, if you go in on one side and come out on the other, you have switched jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Lots of examples were given. One of them was about families in Derry whose kids can't go to swimming lessons because the swimming pool is on the Donegal side.
Yeah.
So very, very simple stuff, which, seemingly would be harmless. And a lot of people saying kind of, Asher, no one will know, or Asher, you won't get stopped, or Asher, nothing will happen.
Yeah.
But the repercussions of something, your asylum claim could be thrown out if your kids go to swimming lessons.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, you know.
Yeah, it's mostly like especially felt by people who I've spoken to who live in rural parts of Donegal, because Derry is the natural kind of urban centre, and that's where the example about the swimming lessons came up, because that's where lots of different amenities would be, and people are cut off from those because of that. But in terms of what you're saying about the border and the different jurisdiction, there's one example that kind of comes up when I speak to people all the time, which is that, you know, if you're living in Donegal and you need to go to Dublin to go to the International Protection Office, the bus goes through the north. That's just the way that the road goes. And people told me that they're told that it's okay as long as you stay on the bus. But you can't, if the bus stops, for example, at a petrol station, which would be in the jurisdiction of the north, you can't get off because you're not allowed.
It's like a sealed container passing through the jurisdiction.
Yeah, but I think it shows what, like, people who study borders are kind of always trying to show, which is that how arbitrary this is, and how the border is like so much more than just like the line in the ground, but that it's about who you are, and that it can, you know.
Two people beside each other on a bus are experiencing an entirely different border.
Exactly.
Or there was another case I remember as well that was really heartbreaking about a woman whose child needed emergency medical intervention, and the only hospital that could perform the procedure, I think, was in Dublin. But then the mother couldn't travel to Dublin because she couldn't leave the 6 counties.
Yeah.
Like that, like the reality of that for people's lives, like, you know, and it's something that most of us have no idea of until we hear these kinds of stories.
Border violence, or the different harms that come from borders, are so much more than of course, like the deaths, the pushbacks, the violence, the detention, but it's also the kind of everyday forms of exclusion that people face, the racialized exclusion that people face because of borders.
What do you say to somebody who say, but the borders are there, they need to be secure? What is sovereignty if not providing a defined and sovereign place that our authorities are in charge of, and in charge of who can come and go?
Well, I maybe would ask them if they'd want to see a return to, you know, a hard border on the island of Ireland, and do they want to have checkpoints? You know, because people are often, they'll say that, but how much of a border do you want for yourself? You know, I think that's...
I know 24 years ago, I think it was, I did a piece about border controls that were happening on the Belfast to Dublin train at that time. The police were boarding at Dundalk and racially profiling people and selecting them for immigration checks, in effect. Is that sort of behavior
that's still
continuing
happening?
To
So this is like another kind of answer to your question, but also that it's not the case that the border is open, even though we don't see it. Like, it still is being very actively policed in a huge way. And in a way that we're seeing more and more, like it's becoming more and more visible. You have the police on both sides of the border cooperating to enforce the border. And even though there's not supposed to be what they call routine immigration checks, there's still checks that are happening all the time on transport routes, which target people based on the colour of their skin. So I've also spoken to people, you know, who are Irish citizens or British citizens who are supposed to be able to travel without producing ID, but they're profiled. And that's something that groups like End Deportations Belfast have been documenting a lot. And it's,
The Taoiseach was sort of saying, well, look, we need to talk about the asylum system, both sides of the border, that it's not really a question. We're not trying to close the border, really we're not. Can you comment on that?
That was something when I was seeing the coverage of the response, like the different kind of the pogroms that erupted in Belfast. Micheál Martin tried to, you know, as so many other politicians were calling for more border enforcement. Micheál Martin kind of, I think, he said that was the wrong issue to focus on, and that instead of focusing on the border, we should be talking about the asylum system and making sure it's more robust, as if that's some kind of a different position, you know. But he's still, I think that's not different than the calls for intensified border security.
It's another kind of prevention.
Yeah, and it still conflates being a migrant with being a criminal in the same way, you know. It was as if, because this response that we saw in Belfast happened after this really brutal knife attack, and that was kind of used to justify pogroms and also these calls for intensification of the border. But yeah, he was making kind of the same point, that like almost implying that that attack wouldn't have happened if we had more border security, which is just ridiculous and really, really dangerous. But it's also what he's calling for about making the asylum system more robust is really like already the status quo and the trajectory that we see in Ireland. Like there's all these different borders within the asylum system, you know, because people might claim asylum because they are fleeing persecution, but also because every other access point is closed off to them. They have the wrong passport, they come from the wrong country, so they can't travel the way that you or I do. And because of that, then the asylum system becomes more securitized. So there's all these extra legal hoops that people have to go through, which means that even people who meet the very, very narrow legal definition of a refugee in international law can't get refugee protection because of all these extra procedures. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's time for us to wind up. It's been a really interesting conversation, Niamh. We'll have to do it again sometime. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks a million,
thank
Niamh,
you.
for coming in.
And thanks, of course, to
Paulie.
you, Paulie, as well. Keep up with The Ditch by WhatsApp by going to ontheditch.com and support The Ditch with a donation or a subscription.